Hi, this is Marcy Casterline O'Rourke here again, and I'm going to be doing movie therapy on the movie taken from the best-selling book, the movie Lovely Bones. And I call this video podcast Sins of the Flesh. As I said in the introduction to the first night video, this video also isn't based on my own personal experience. I offer my thoughts and ideas about this movie based on my observations. Stories can appear to be about a murder like this one, but also have an alternate psychological interpretation. If this movie made you feel something, or if you identified with it in some way, maybe my ideas will help spur you to understand what your feelings were telling you. This movie appears to be about a young girl who was raped and murdered by her seemingly innocuous neighbor. Now, you're going to have to bear with me here because I see something buried in this plot and these characters that can indicate a hidden psychological story, in addition to the obvious movie story. I could be all wrong, but so much in this movie has sinister overtones and veiled meanings that really can't be ignored and are hard to explain away unless you're looking at some deeper psychological story. I worked on interpreting this movie because, in a way, it's the natural sequel to First Night, in a bizarre way, but nevertheless, it seems to me to be a sequel. It shows metaphorically the psychological damage that a girl child can experience due to the relationship distortions in a marriage like the one in First Night. The hints of psychological depth of this movie begin right away as we see a little girl, her father, and her snow globe. Her father says that the penguin in the snow globe is trapped in a perfect world. This memory is very important to Susie, who is the little girl, who tells us at the age of 14 that she was raped and murdered. As we will see at the end of the movie, she is in fact trapped in a perfect world of childhood and can't grow up in the real world. Susie is given a camera for her 14th birthday and wants to be a wildlife photographer. Could this mean that she feels trapped in her perfect suburban life and wants to explore the wilder and wider side of the world? One of the first scenes is Mommy reading Camus and Daddy kissing her as a prelude to having sex. Somehow, a woman reading Camus in a t-shirt is not anybody I know's idea of a sexy woman. But that's how it starts. So Susie, their daughter, who's just turning 14, has her first boyfriend, and surprise, surprise, her admirer is also something of an intellectual. He's dark and foreign, and this is the usual trope in romance novels for the sexy guy. They almost kiss in school and set a date to meet at the mall. We hear Susie discuss the lead-up to her murder from her point of view in heaven. Her murderer was a man from her neighborhood. He lives just a few doors away and seems to have no job but a perfect middle-class house, just like Susie's. His hobby is making dollhouses with furniture to scale. Very interestingly, Susie's own father's hobby is making ships in bottles. Her father is a rather vague person who is mildly masculine, unlike Susie's boyfriend, the sexy dark lover. And her father is a far cry from wildlife, that's for sure. Also, the murdering neighbor is about the same age, height, and build as her father. He's not a big hulking monster or a nerdy weirdo, although he does wear glasses, but most of us don't regard wearing glasses as a sure indication of the sexual predator. But his glasses are the only difference between him and Susie's father. Walking home from school the day of the almost kiss, Susie meets the neighbor murderer in a deserted field. Just happens to come upon him. And there he tempts her to enter a buried bunker that he has very oddly dug and furnished right out in this field. He talks her into entering his trap by asking her if she doesn't want to be the first one to try it. Are we talking here about entering his little bunker, or are we talking about losing her virginity? and they go underground, which of course is always symbolic of the unconscious, although not usually quite so obviously. The murderer has filled this bunker room with all sorts of childhood toys, stuffed animals, candles, and cute little figurines, much like the cluttered symbols and urges we all have buried in our subconscious. Then, since Susie's in heaven, we know what's coming. He won't let her leave. He rapes her and cuts her body up, dissolves her flesh, and puts her bones in a safe. That's all that's left of her, bones, no flesh. Her newly developed, fleshy, sexual self is utterly and completely destroyed by this father figure. Flesh is synonymous with sensuality, and 14 is the age of the onset of puberty and sexual awakening. Flesh is what allows us to feel. As we grow up and mature, our flesh does too. But Susie's flesh is destroyed in a very thorough way, in a very bloody way. She goes to heaven without ever being kissed. Whose subconscious is this really that's out there in this field, in that bizarre bunker? Who is the murderer, really? Later in the movie, the father is stalking the murderer in a cornfield that is a kind of a local lover's lane. A pair of those lovers, who the murderer is actually spying on, mistake her father for the peeping Tom and beat him up. He is punished for the crimes of the murderer. I think the murderer and the father are two halves of the same person. I think the weird bunker is in fact a representation of Susie's father's narcissist subconscious. Narcissist men are often rather nastily degrading of female sexuality. Perhaps it's a threat to their fixation on themselves. They perceive women finding them attractive as degrading, and they are degrading of those women who are attracted to them. It's not the kind of admiration they want. They refuse to see themselves as sex objects, although they usually preen and perfect every physical feature. They are the Lancelots in the first-night marriages, whose wives also share a disdain for females and female sexuality, for their own very different reasons. Susie's father is not an extreme narcissist, but he's attractive enough, and his wife is, well, a reader of Camus in bed, not very sexy. It's my guess that the daughter of a man like this, who is very vain and self-absorbed, will find that the early signs of her sexuality are promptly and thoroughly squashed by devastating and very well-timed verbal put-downs. There she will be, her flesh will be constantly mortified by her father, the man in her life, until he has effectively killed that part of her being. She will be sexually destroyed, or as in the movie's metaphor, murdered, before she gets out of puberty. This is a very vulnerable time for a young woman when she's beginning to develop visible signs of her femaleness, of her femininity, of her female sexuality. She's developing all the very things that men find attractive, and quite often men will make remarks about. But when your father starts making disparaging remarks about your sexuality you can't escape, it can be devastating, and I think that's what this movie is about. This is the murder of the movie. All that is left of Susie is her bones, and bones cannot commit sins of the flesh, and they can't feel anything either. And this is done right in front of her mother, who, in an unconscious pact with the husband of the first night's story, still herself denigrates sexy women. She certainly isn't a sexy woman herself. But this is confirmed by another obvious plot clue. When Susie's mother can no longer stand being part of her family after the murder, her husband invites her mother to stay with them. Now, this maternal grandmother is the opposite of Susie's mother. And this, I think, is meant as a comment also on feminine sexuality. She's a blowsy dame who drinks too much, smokes, and is titillated by Susie's sexual awakening during a previous visit. She is loud and bossy, with little regard for the husband, who seems to all but disappear into the scenery in the presence of this sexy woman. Grandma is everything Susie's mother is not, and Grandma is made to be offensive, so we know that her untamed sexuality is foreign to this family. She is a kind of wildlife. There are lots more clues in this film that are metaphors to affirm the hidden psychological meaning of this movie. These clues include things like Susie's version of heaven. It's a teenage girl's cutesy paradise of pastel colors and blue sky and clouds and laughter, but nothing mature at all. Susie can never leave the perfect snow globe because the evil murderer, her father's double, has robbed her of her flesh. The end of the movie sums it up perfectly. Susie says the bones have made connections for her. She has learned how to, quote, hold the world without being in it. And that is what happens to girls who are destroyed by their father's narcissist anger and jealousy. They make connections, but they are not able to live and be sexually alive in this world. And as I said at the beginning of the video on first night, unbalanced marriages have knock-on effects on the children. I have seen some of the difficulties in my son. For the first 10 years of my marriage, Tom was on the soap opera. I had made friends of some of the people who worked there, so it was a little more difficult for Tom to pursue his extramarital flirtations without me hearing about it. But when we moved to California and our son was born, Tom was in the Hollywood paradise of sexual promiscuity. But he kept that carefully hidden from me by isolating me from anyone who might hear industry gossip and tell me what he was doing. And when his playing around only served to ruin his career, he became more and more depressed, but continued the same behavior. The terrible half-truth that my son and I lived with and sacrificed everything for was Tom's excuse story that if only he could work more as an actor, he would stop drinking and smoking himself to death. It wasn't his fault. It was Hollywood, because they hadn't appreciated him and made him a star. That is what made him so unavailable to us as a husband and father. And this leads to the next movie that I will analyze, both the original and the newest version of A Star is Born. It's taken a long time for both of us to regrow ourselves as full human beings rather than suffering martyrs to Tom's depression. That's why I'm doing this. We wasted so much of our lives in Tom's terrible, tragic world, and I include Tom in that. He was only half there in his life. If only he'd been able to look at what he was doing more objectively and seen the damage he was doing to himself and those who loved him. He wouldn't be dead now. Movie therapy. Use it. Hone your narrative down to its truth as best as you can, and you might be able to be much happier. I hope so. Thank you for listening. I wish you a great life.